Hello. So today I wanted to show you guys something interesting that I was watching and I was looking at while I was doing some benchmarks. So what I was looking at was I was trying to figure out a way to lock all of my clocks on all of my different components in my computer. And the reason why I wanted to do this was because when your CPU clock is fluctuating, it doesn't really matter if it's fluctuating from 3 gigahertz all the way up to 5 gigahertz, because what's happening is that that's also causing a massive variation in the amount of FPS you're getting, and that in turn can cause a massive variation in the frame times and the input lag, because as we know, frame rate is affecting input lag. And so I wanted to essentially lock all of my clocks to essentially a flat static rate, even if I had to trade a little bit of frequency jumping. So even if I had to trade a couple hundred megahertz, that's fine because I'd rather have that than a fluctuating clock that's going all over the place. And so one of the things that I found that I could do was I could set my CPU clock in, the computer to actually run at a stable clock, so 5.2, and that was really nice, and that produced a really good consistent frame rate. And because there's essentially no fluctuation in the CPU, it doesn't have any sort of um, you know problems where it's jumping up and down all the time. And so that was super nice. But then I was still trying to figure out how I could do that with my GPU clock, because my GPU is just as important as my CPU clock is. And so I found that what you can do is if you go into the core clock right here, and then if you hover over this part, you'll see that all of the actual frequency to actual voltage measurements are completely flat. So this core clock is completely flat. So regardless of temperature, it will stay the same. Regardless of voltage, it will stay the same. And the yellow line here is essentially where I locked it to. So if you're looking at yours, so if I just save this profile and then I go back like this is what your clock will probably look like. And it's just a nice steady curve. And the idea is that, as you have a lower temperature, it can increase the voltage, and that'll give you, the essentially the max clock that the computer can run at. Well, if I go like this and I click L, and I essentially, so let's try to do it like right around here, right? If I click L on the computer keyboard here, and I click L, and I press the check mark right here, it'll lock it to that frequency for me. So that was super nice. But what I noticed is that when the GPU got too hot when I was running these benchmarks, the algorithm that NVIDIA has for this would automatically kick in, and then it would just drop the clocks. And so that's why this method only really works if you're able to control the temperature. But if you can't control the temperature, then this method is kind of a trade-off. So it will go back to this if it stays cool, but as soon as it starts getting a little bit too hot, it will revert itself back to the standard behavior, which is just fluctuating all up and down. And so that was where I discovered that there's a fun trick you can do where you can use either shift, and shift will move the bar up and down slightly a little bit, right? And so you can adjust it kind of how you want. Don't go above 2000 if you're on the 30 series because it'll crash the computer. So you can go like this, and then if you hold control, you can actually adjust it in terms of it's the base right here. So this is control, and then this is shift. And so that's just some fun little features you can do. And so what I did was I essentially shifted this all the way down to about 1550 megahertz. And then what I did is that I raised it all the way up to the top like this, where I took the base one. Sorry, I'm trying to grab it here. I took the base one and I lifted it all the way up like that. And then I took the center part and I dragged it down towards where I want it to go. And then if you hit the check mark, you'll notice that the actual frequency starts to flatline. So then I just slowly kept doing that, just over and over again, just raising it by a little bit, lowering it by a little bit, and then eventually the curve starts to get much, much flatter, and everything starts to become much more stable as a result of this. And so you'll notice that there will be a certain kind of capping out point. I found that mine is around 1700, so I can't run my computer much farther than 1700 megahertz. So that's what you can do, is you can essentially lock the frequency to an exact amount. So that way you not only have your CPU clock being perfectly consistent, but you also have your GPU clock as well. So that was just a fun thing that I ran. And then I was like, well, how does that affect the actual FPS in the game? Because that's kind of the only thing that really matters here. And how does that affect the frame times as well? And so what I did is I ran the Heaven benchmark, just a simple benchmark, very synthetic, a very controlled environment essentially. And what I did was I ran the benchmarks. My benchmark here is the unlocked benchmark, and that runs at just the normal behavior. I ran it at essentially everything maxed out, ran it at 75% on the fan, and then I ran it at 1500% because that's what my GPU can run at base in terms of stable 24/7. And I did that for all of it. And then I just ran that benchmark, and then what I noticed is that this was what I got when I ran it pretty much every single time, was a very consistent, stable score of about 177.9 on the 0.2% and 303 on the 0.1% or the 1% lows, and then an average of 438. Well, once I finally started locking the clocks, so this was me locking the clock in the same way that you would normally. So if I go into here, that would be me going right here and then pressing L and then the check mark. And that ran at the 1700 megahertz that I was looking for, and this was the result I got. And it was actually surprisingly a little bit better, even though in theory it shouldn't, because it's about 200 megahertz, 300 megahertz lower than what NVIDIA's algorithm could do for you anyway. And so that was just something super cool. But then when I realized that I could actually flatline the curve in terms of making sure that it's absolutely completely flatlining, so there's no jumping in frequency or anything like that, I reran it a bunch of times, and what I noticed is that the benchmark got even better. So from base, we are seeing right here, if I select the 0.2 percentiles, we are seeing about a 10% uplift in our 0.2 percentile lows and a little bit of an increase in our 0.1 percentile lows. And so that was just something that I found was super cool, is that I was able to not only get the benefit of much better input lag, much better frame rates, and better frame times. So everything across the board benefits. And then what was also nice is that if you actually look at the variances, as I started to go around with my actual like manipulating the clock, what I noticed is that the frame times in the variances got even better than before. And so there will be a few different hitches in the Heaven benchmark, but in terms of the blue, what we want is the blue, because the actual benchmark is running at 400 FPS. And so that means that we want to have roughly 2.5 milliseconds to around 3.5 milliseconds. So everything from the light blue and the dark blue, because everything past this point is kind of the natural stutters that occur in the benchmark because it's changing the scene. But what you'll notice is that the unlocked one did much worse in terms of the variances, and then the yellow was actually much wider, and the orange was too. And everything past about the blue is going to be really noticeable, because especially if you're running at like 400 FPS, this is going to start being more in like the 100 to 200 FPS range. And so this was something super cool, was that once you actually learn to lock the clocks down, the actual benefits are, they may be small because this is 99.5 to 99.6, but it's all about just consistency and improvement. So yeah, this may not be a crazy benefit in total, but why would you not want to do this? Why would you want to have a clock that's fluctuating all the time, causing input lag and lots of spikes in FPS? Why would you not want to have something that's more consistent? Sure, you're trading like what, maybe a couple percentages on a random benchmark or a random game, but in terms of the total value you get, it's a lot more approachable and a lot more beneficial. And so I just figured that was just something I would share with you guys. So yeah, I recommend doing this. If you need to kind of figure out where your GPU can sit on a flat curve, I found that 1600 to 1700 is where mine sits at. So if I try to set it at like a flat line of 1800, it'll crash the system and then I have to reset. But if I do around 1700 to 1600, it runs perfectly consistent, and regardless of temperature, it will stay the same no matter what. Because if you do this method with just clicking L and then the check mark, this method works, but only if you can keep the window within 5 to 10 degrees. So if you really want the actual full benefits of a full maxed out clock, it will draw a lot of power, because remember, this is 1200 millivolts here, so that's a lot of voltage actually going through there, so that's going to draw a lot of heat. But if you can manage it, why not? it may benefit you. If I can get it stable, then I'll report back on that as well. But in terms of if we want to run a nice, cool, steady system and have still a very good benefit in FPS and frame times, then what we can do is we can just do what I did, where we just set the actual voltage curve to a flat line just like that. And that way we don't have to worry about anything like that. And then we just get all of the benefits of having a perfectly stable system, because now our CPU clock is controlled, our GPU clock is controlled, and everything else in the system is just whatever else we control, like for example the Windows processes. So yeah guys, thank you for watching this video. Like it if it helped you guys out. Yeah, subscribe, share this video around with friends.